Hello, and welcome to the third video in my brand new series where I'm going genre by genre, sharing my top 10 favorites. We've done fantasy, we've done sci-fi, and now it's time for horror. It's so funny because I've classified myself as a scaredy cat for my entire life. I do not watch scary movies, and up until recently, I did not read scary books. But a couple years ago, I started dipping my toe into the world of literary horror, and I must say that I have come to love the way that horror allows authors an opportunity to explore some of the darkest aspects of the human condition, some of our traumas, some of our pain and suffering through this more vulnerable, raw, visceral lens. And using different tropes or common aspects of horror like the haunted house or body horror or a possession as metaphor for a whole host of different themes and issues that authors are wanting to explore is absolutely fascinating to me, and I love it. On top of that, of course, horror can just be fun and scary and exciting. And sometimes you just want to read something that gets your heart pumping, gets the adrenaline running in a safe environment where you are not the one running away from a serial killer. So in today's video, I'm going to go through my top 10 favorite horror novels. To be fair, like I said, horror is still a newer genre for me, so I don't have as many years of backlog of reading in this genre as I do something like fantasy or sci-fi, but I have been reading a good amount of horror in the last couple years, so I feel like I have quite a few good ones to share. That being said, I do know that I'm missing a lot of classic horror that I have not gotten around to yet. I'm slowly working on it. So if I'm missing something that you think I'm really gonna love based on my favorites here, please leave them in the comments down below or just share your top horror books of all time. I would love to know them. I'd love to add to my horror TBR. And of course, just like with the sci-fi and fantasy videos, I'll be sharing my top 10 here, but I'll also be making a second part 2 video that is exclusive for my patrons, where I'm gonna be sharing easily another 10 to 20 favorites that didn't fit in my top 10 but are still so worth being recommended and read. So if you want even more recommendations in any of the genres that I've covered already or plan on covering in the future, consider joining us on Patreon. You can join at any of the 4 paid tier levels and get access to all these bonus videos. So without further ado, starting with number 10, we have Bunny by Mona Awad. This is such a polarizing book. Not everyone is going to consider this horror, although I think it is definitely the most apt genre categorization, literary horror or weird lit, but Bunny is such a strange book and it certainly doesn't work for everyone, but I absolutely loved this book. It is so gloriously strange. It is so steeped in the pretension that is MFA programs and academia for creatives. This is really a satire of academia, and it brings in commentary on isolation and belonging and the cult-like quality that can grow within groups, especially groups that are in competition with each other for a limited amount of praise or success, like within an academic setting. This book really makes you question what is the main character's perception and what is reality. There is a lot of dreamlike, hazy, confusing, strange stuff happening, and I love when horror does this. I love not being 100% sure if anything that's happening is real. I love questioning if the main character is having a break with reality or if this is just the strange reality they have found themselves in. This book has gore, this book has creepy cult-like behavior, and it has that academia satire that I just absolutely love. It is so pretentious and intentionally so as a commentary, and as someone who is self-described pretty darn pretentious, I just loved it. I thought it was great on so many levels. This was my first introduction to Mona Awad, and I have really enjoyed continuing to read her work over the years, but this remains my favorite of hers. And if you haven't read it and you enjoy weird lit, you really should. Okay, but do you know what's truly horrifying? Reaching your 30s and realizing that your body doesn't just naturally hold on to all of the strength and endurance and mobility and conditioning that you've worked to build through your entire lifetime if you don't maintain it. I feel like that seems super obvious, but apparently not that obvious to me, because now that I'm in my 30s, I've been very shocked to discover that I won't maintain everything that I built from 25 years of dancing if I don't continue dancing for hours every single day. So I've been really trying to refocus in on my physical health and trying to support my physical well-being with regular exercise. But I have found that I haven't really naturally fallen back into any kind of strength training, and I am not naturally very strong. I am like a limp noodle. I'm very tall and lanky, and I feel like that's always kind of resulted in a struggle to have enough strength to lift and move my very long body. And that's why I'm so excited about this video sponsor, Ladder, because they are helping me with that final piece, focusing on strength, building that strength back up, and then maintaining it. So as I go through my 30s and beyond, I have that strength to support all my joints and make sure that I stay healthy as I continue to live my life. It's something that becomes increasingly important over time, and I'm definitely reckoning with that right now. Ladder is a strength training app that gives you a plan from an expert coach every single day. It's like having your own personal trainer without the ridiculous cost and the weird scheduling and having to travel outside your house, but you still get the same expert guidance you need to actually reach your goals and to stay motivated the whole time. Ladder is all about expert strength training plans. These aren't influencer plans. These are the real deal put together by people who know what they're talking about. And Ladder is really unique in the fitness app space. They're unlike any other app because they're not just a library of pre-recorded workouts. They're progressive overload plans put together by your coach every single week. And Ladder really has everything you need to either get back into strength training or into strength training for the first time. You have videos, you have demos, in-ear coaching, a journal to track your progress and weights, and the experience and knowledge and motivation from your coach and your team to keep you excited about working out every day. You can ask your coach questions in the team chat and motivate your fellow team members. I loved that I could choose what team I wanted to join based on my goals, but also the kinds of equipment I have on hand. I have a kettlebell, I have one set of lightweight dumbbells, and a little bit of space, and that's about it. So I was able to choose a team that kind of meets me where I'm at for the type of exercise I'm interested in doing, my goals, and also what I have on hand. And I love that there are so many different teams, and you can also change teams if your goals or situation evolve over time. Because Ladder is sponsoring this video, you can click the link in my description box and get 45% off. That's 45% off with the link in my description box, so click it and try Ladder today. No more random workouts and no more guesswork at the gym. Plus, it costs less than $1 a day. Thank you to Ladder for sponsoring this video. I am so excited to finally have a logical plan to follow so I can get my strength back. It's something that I didn't really value until it was gone. Next, I want to talk about Ring Shout by Djeli Clark. This is a historical horror, a cosmic horror, and it is imagining the KKK as literal monsters. This book is all about exploring the horror that is existing as a Black person in the South at the height of the KKK and translating it through horror as a genre into something that is so deeply, bone-chillingly terrifying and unsettling and disturbing. And again, this is what I love about horror. I feel like it allows authors the opportunity to explore these aspects of our lives that are absolutely horrifying and terrifying and disgusting and disturbing and wrong, and to present them to the reader in the fullness of that horror and disgust. We are able to really fully immerse ourselves in that raw, visceral, disturbing reality. And there is something cathartic about that experience. I really enjoyed the commentary here. I thought the characters were really well developed. The plot is really tightly paced, and it was very exciting and intense and action-packed all the way through. It is terrifying, it is creepy, it is unsettling. And talking about white nationalism and overt, violent racism, which is something that I would have hoped we left behind in 1915 Georgia, but unfortunately is something that is still alive and well, and people are seemingly feeling more and more comfortable to be overt and open about their affiliation with white nationalists lately, and it's disturbing and makes books like this continually and endlessly relevant. If you haven't tried any of Djeli Clark's work, he often incorporates an element of the magical or the surreal in his work, and this book is no different, but it's certainly firmly planted in reality in terms of its themes and its impact. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend. Moving on to number 8 on my list, which is Sisters of the Lost Nation by Nick Medina. This one has a hint of supernatural horror, but is once again mostly very firmly planted within the horror of real people doing real horrific things to each other. And if you are living in North America, you were likely familiar with the huge problem that is missing and murdered Indigenous women. It is an epidemic, and this book takes a look at one possible explanation, one possible circumstance of Indigenous women being targeted by vile, evil human beings, and shows how that can play out from an Indigenous perspective, through an Indigenous lens. And this book absolutely destroyed me emotionally. It is so harrowing. It is so difficult to read. The main character is absolutely fantastic. I just felt for them so deeply. Their motivation for what they're doing is so deeply rooted in their emotional core, and it's impossible not to feel for them. This was very fast-paced, very gripping. I don't think I took a break the entire time I read this book. I was locked in for the entirety. And I can't say too much without spoiling things, but I thought this book was so masterfully done. It made me feel so many different emotions so incredibly strongly. It just hooked me entirely and really brings to light such an important issue in that really raw, visceral way that horror facilitates. And I would highly recommend this book, though just like all the books I'm recommending in this video, please check out the content warnings before picking it up, because this one, just like pretty much every book on this list, contains content that might be incredibly upsetting depending on your lived experience. So just take care of yourself, because I have certainly found that I have been sort of hit over the head with material that I was not prepared for in reading horror sometimes. So always take care of yourself, but this book is absolutely incredible and you need to read it. Next up, number 7 on my list is The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. This is historical horror with a sprinkling of supernatural horror. In this book, we follow a young Black boy named Robbie who is sent to this brutal reformatory boarding school for troubled youth, where he is forced into child labor and experiences abuse from fellow children and from the adults running the school. And at the same time as dealing with all this real life horror and suffering, he is faced with the supernatural horror that is the ghosts of children who have suffered and died at this school in the past, who are still haunting the grounds. This reminds me of Sisters of the Lost Nation in many ways in its sort of emotional core. It is so hard to watch Robbie suffer because you feel for him so deeply. This book is exploring racism and systemic abuse, the deep, enduring bonds of family, community, and resilience. Ghosts in this book are in many ways a metaphor for historical or cultural memory, and there is just so much here to dig into. It is such a beautiful book. It is such a devastating book, and it really immerses you in 1950s Florida. It is fast-paced, it is harrowing, it is intense, it is horrifying and disturbing, it is hopeful and powerful and inspiring. It made me feel so many things. It made me sob like a little baby. It made me stay up all night, frantically trying to find out what happens next, hoping with every fiber of my being that Robbie would be okay. It is such an incredible book, and it's such a great example of how horror allows us to crack open some of the most disturbing, shameful elements of our past as the human race, and interrogate the ways that we have turned against each other and the ways that we have used each other and abused each other, the harms of systemic racism, the harms of systemic abuse, the ways that children have been left to fend for themselves in these absolutely corrupt and twisted systems. It is a very difficult book to read. It is so hard to face these realities. And as much as this book has a more supernatural element, it is so firmly planted in reality. These schools existed. This kind of abuse happened. And I think horror can sometimes be such an effective way to allow us to face these realities and acknowledge in their fullness how horrific they truly are. Horror doesn't just have to be the most world-ending, the most over-exaggerated, the most twisted serial killer someone can come up with. It can be literal reality, human history. Our history is so littered with horror, and this book does such a wonderful job of telling Robbie's story. It does it with so much heart and sincerity and care. It is based on a real story and a real person, and it's incredible. So please read The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. It's masterful. Moving on to number 6 on my list, we have Natural Beauty by Ling Huang. Natural beauty falls into one of my favorite subgenres of horror, which is the exploration of unattainable and harmful beauty standards for women through a horror lens. And in this case, we have some pretty visceral, disturbing body horror, but we also have psychological horror. We also have this dystopian element to it. And there's so much commentary here on beauty standards and how unattainable they are, how harmful they are, how Eurocentric beauty standards in particular are so homogenizing and especially harmful to women of color or people of color. There is so much to be gleaned here about beauty standards, and that really is the main focus of the novel. But there's also so much more happening outside of that, especially for the main character's experience with her parents being a first-generation American, her parents being immigrants, and her connection with her parents, her shame when it comes to her parents, and her expectations of who she should be. This book goes into the abuses that can happen with child prodigies and young people who are incredibly talented in the arts and sent away to specialty training programs without parental supervision. This book gets into class disparity and wealth inequality. It gets into responsibility to care for your parents in their older age. It goes into, like I said, all of these elements of beauty standards and wellness culture. There is so much here, and it is so twisted and strange and disturbing, and it just, again, horror doing what horror does best, which is exploring real aspects of our society, of our lives, but putting that visceral, disturbing lens on it that allows us to really crack it open and look at all the messiness inside. The direction this book goes is not at all what I expected when I started reading it, and it is gloriously strange. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to ruin it for you, but just believe me, if you are interested in horror that explores beauty standards, if you are interested in a first-generation American with immigrant parents experience some really beautiful stuff to do with her connection with her parents and that sort of dichotomy of an intense love and appreciation, but also a shame and a need to be separate and independent, the push and pull of wanting to fit in and be part of a homogenous group and to be one among many, but also to strive for uniqueness and to remain connected to your culture and to your past and to your ancestry and to your parents and to everything they sacrificed for you. There is so much here. It is so gloriously disturbing and strange and gross. It is absolutely fantastic, and I just never stop thinking about it, especially as a musician, especially as someone who has always been connected to music and performance. If you are a musician, if you're an artist, if you're a dancer or a painter, I think you will connect to this book on a whole other level because the author is a professional violinist and this protagonist is a piano prodigy. And there is so much in this book about the power and the overwhelming obsession that can come from music, but also the emotional expression and the connection and the love and the sort of transcendental quality of music. This book blew me away. It does so many things so well, and I highly recommend, obviously. Next on my list, number 5, is a book that I initially gave 4 stars. Actually, I also initially gave Natural Beauty 4 stars, but both of these I bumped up to 5 after a while because they just would not leave my brain. This one is A House at the Bottom of the Lake by Josh Malerman. Now, if this book did not perfectly play into one of my phobias, it probably would be a little lower on this list, but as someone who has always dealt with just a little sprinkling of thalassophobia, this book is terrifying. It is so disturbing and unsettling and scary. And I still have dreams about it. The images that my brain built out of the words on the page are so disturbing and strange and eerie, and my brain won't let go. I think about this book way too often, and I think it's intensified my thalassophobia, to be honest. But it is so good. If you're a fan of WeirdLit, if you find lakes and other various bodies of water quite unsettling, and if you like the idea of a young couple in the summer coming across a whole house just sitting on the bottom of a lake, seemingly intact, and they go down to explore it and find way more than they bargained for. Read this book. It is so unsettling. This really is a book about love in a lot of ways and sort of obsessive first love, but really so much of what has stayed with me from this book is just the scenes within the house at the bottom of the lake, and that imagery, again, will probably never leave my brain ever. And I will think about it every time I happen to be near a lake, probably for the rest of my life. So again, if this did not so perfectly fit into one of my phobias, again, probably would be closer to 10th on this list. It's not a perfect book by any means, but because of how perfectly it pushes my own personal fear buttons, it has to be pretty high up because, again, repeated nightmares on this one. And that also ties in with the next on this list, which I think overall is a more perfect book, not objectively, because who can say that objectively, but subjectively, in my opinion, a more perfect book, but also feeds right into that fun little fear of water that I have, and that is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is another one that is solidly in the WeirdLit category. This is strange, hazy, dreamlike perception versus reality. What is happening? Is any of this actually happening? What is real? What is reality in general? Who knows? This is a book focusing on a lesbian couple, and one of the wives goes on a deep sea mission and comes back different. And her wife is trying to help her, trying to accommodate this transformation that seems to be happening, trying to understand her wife, trying to support her wife, trying to find her wife in this being that seems to be anything but. It is unsettling and uncomfortable. There is some weird body horror stuff. There is, again, some deep sea terror. If you're afraid of the water, would recommend. It's really a book about love and grief and loss and transformation, but that cosmic horror element, the unknowability of the deep sea, there is so much in here. It is such a beautiful book. It is so poetically written. It is such an immersive experience. It is like poetry. It is gloriously queer and sapphic. There is so much love here, completely and inextricably tied with the horror. And if you haven't read it, please go read it right now. This is one of my favorite books of all time in general, but also just an incredible example of horror. Next on my list, number 3, is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I love this book. It is a classic in the horror genre. It is psychological horror, gothic horror. In some ways, it comes across very comedic, but it has this slow, creeping, eerie sense of dread that just continuously builds and builds and builds until it can't build any longer. The main character, really all the characters in this book, are gloriously strange. There is something so unsettling and uncomfortable about these characters, about this house, about this town. It's about isolation and persecution and family trauma and the cruelty of society and this walls closing in on you, agoraphobic sort of quality to it. It is fantastic. It is a classic for a reason. It is my favorite Shirley Jackson that I have read to this point, and just an absolute pleasure to read, which is kind of a weird thing to say about horror, but in this case, completely accurate. Moving on to my second favorite horror novel of all time, we have House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This is another one that is very controversial, very contentious. Lots of people hate this book with a burning passion. And lots of people absolutely adore it, and I am in that second group. I love this book. It is so strange. Cosmic horror, psychological horror, satire and commentary, layers and layers and layers of stories within stories. It is so overly complex in an almost laughably ridiculous way that only adds to the obsessive quality that you gain as a reader, which ties so perfectly in to the obsession of these characters who are trying to decipher academic papers discussing a lost documentary that is all about a house that is bigger on the inside, that seems to go on forever, that seems to contain multitudes of horrors. And there are so many layers to this that it's almost impossible to describe without getting very much into spoilers, which I do not want to do. But this really is an opus on obsession and family trauma. It is so existential in its horror. It is a really great example of using format as an addition to horror with some really creative experimental formatting throughout the book. I would definitely recommend the physical copy for this one because every page is an adventure. Every page brings you something new. There is so much frantic flipping front and back to all the footnotes, turning the book sideways and upside down. The formatting itself really drives the pace at which you read and adds to a frantic quality at the climax. This book is terrifying, but it's also heartfelt and emotional. It is touching on grief and loss and family and connection and loneliness and obsession, and has some really hilarious commentary on the pretension of academia, similarly to Bunny. It is a tome. It is a commitment to read. It takes effort, but in my opinion was 100% worth it. This is a book that I will never forget. I have not reread it yet, but it is coming soon. I'm going to reread it very soon because I can't wait to experience this for a second time. Again, some people hate this book with their whole being, but if you're not one of those people, you're probably going to be in the other camp, which is the one I'm in, which is that this is such a fantastic book. It is so fun to read, and it has a lot of interesting things to say. So, House of Leaves is my second favorite horror novel of all time, and that brings us to my favorite, the best horror novel I have ever read, and that is Monstrilio by Gerardo Semeno Cordova. I am obsessed with this book. This was the best book I read in all of 2023, entire year. All of the 127-ish books I read that year, this was the best, okay? This is literary horror with little sprinklings of body horror in there, but it's really a story about family and love and grief and loss, a story about not being able to let go, essentially, and a real-life monstrous personification of the ways that our grief can turn sour and turn into something we can't control if we don't deal with it and process it. It is gorgeous, it is unsettling, it is heart-wrenching, it is funny at times, it is beautiful, and an exploration of unconditional love and identity and transformation, and like I said, at its core, really family and love and grief and loss. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It is so beautifully written. It made me feel so many feelings. I cried reading this. I laughed. I was shocked. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous example of literary horror. And in this book, we follow our protagonist, who is a young mother whose child passes away, and she can't let her child go entirely, so she carves out a little piece of his lung and keeps it in a jar, and that piece of lung transforms and grows into a monstrous creature who she then mothers as if it's her child reborn. And it just has so much to say, so much commentary. It has such a diversity of queer rep and really, uses that monstrous transformation as a metaphor for existing in the world as a queer person in similar ways to something like Walking Practice, which was a more recent read of mine. But this just really at its core is so much about that unconditional love and the loss and the twisting and contorting and rotting twistedness that is grief that is left untended to, unprocessed, left to fester, like a little piece of lung in a jar under your bed that turns into a monster. It is such a beautiful book. It is such a weird book. One of my favorite books that I've ever read in my entire life, to be honest. And if you love horror and you haven't read this yet, you need to go read it right now because it's stunning. Absolutely stunning. So with that, we've come to the end of my list. Those are my 10 favorite horror novels that I have ever read in my life. Don't forget to click the link in my description box to get 45% off from Ladder. That's 45% off when you click the link in my description box. Thanks again to Ladder for sponsoring this video. I hope you enjoyed this list. I hope you came across something new that you maybe haven't picked up before. I hope you added 1 or 2 or 10 to your TBR. If you did add any to your to-be-read list, please let me know in the comments which ones you're interested in. One of my favorite things about making these videos so far is getting to read your comments and find out which of the books I talked about are now books that you're excited to read. I feel a little like frisson of excitement every time that maybe one of my favorites is going to become someone else's new favorite. So please let me know in the comments which ones you're going to be picking up, and let me know, like I said, your favorite horror of all time, either a long list or just one or two favorites. Let me know any horror novels you think I might like based on this list. And if you want even more horror recommendations, join my Patreon, because a part 2 to this video exclusive to my patrons will be going up in the next week or so, where you will be getting 10 to 20 more horror recommendations. And in general, the Patreon is just a really good time. We have fun in the Discord. So with that, I'm gonna wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already for more bookish content. And with that, I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.